Every Wednesday on the show, our listener question. So if there's a business or a money issue that's troubling you, you can email me at business@HOT102.7.co.za and we'll find the very best person to help you out. Now, Aben Santon has done just that, and he wants to know how one becomes a board member, a company director. Is there any training required, he asks, or do you get trained once appointed? Well, I guess it's an interesting one. Professor Parmi Natesan is with us, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Directors of South Africa. Parmi, good evening to you and a very warm welcome. So let's wade straight in here. What are the typical qualifications or skills required to become a board member?
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. Yes, it's a bit of a difficult question, and I'm going to assume the question is directed at becoming a non-executive director. And, the way directorship works is that there's no separate profession at this point in time to become a director. So what I mean by that is generally people would follow or pursue other careers or professions, be it in the accounting space, legal space, engineering, medical, whatever it is. And they grow in their career to the point of then becoming executives in their companies and then eventually be appointed as non-executive directors to be overseeing other entities. So whilst it isn't a profession in its own right formally, at the Institute of Directors, we're certainly trying to advocate for it becoming a profession. We feel it's a very critical role. And we've all seen things go wrong when non-executive directors don't perform their functions properly. We've seen various examples in South Africa. We've seen examples even in the Zondo Commission findings, etc. I think it's very critical that we understand what are the role of these non-executive directors, right? They're there to have an outside-in perspective on a company. They're there to steer the strategy, to oversee management, to ensure that there are processes and controls in place. And in order to do that, you need a certain level of business acumen. You need, if I can say, blood, sweat, and tears, having been through the trenches in business to be able to, use your knowledge, skills, and experience to add value to that company. So there aren't specific requirements, and legally our Companies Act is actually very silent on it. It just says there's some disqualification criteria. So it says you can't be an unrehabilitated insolvent and you can't have been committed of fraud and whatnot. But that sets the bar very low, right? Because 99% of us won't tick those boxes and therefore we can become directors. I think what there needs to be, which is what the IoD is pushing for, is to have actually competencies that people are tested against. So we have a director competency framework that we believe outlines the competencies that directors need. And that's a combination of technical competencies, so your knowledge of business, of reading a set of financial statements, of understanding governance and risk and compliance and all these technical things, balanced with certain personal and social competencies. So communication skills, interpretation skills, reading between the lines, asking the right questions, those sorts of things are critical as well.
Parmi, Abe might want to know what the difference is between an exec and non-exec director.
Sure. So if I can just give by way of example, I work at the Institute of Directors and I've been promoted over the years into various roles. And when I became the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Directors, I'm an executive director on the board of the IoD. That means whilst I'm a board member, a voting board member, I'm actually day-to-day involved in the operations of the entity. I'm an employee of the entity, and that's the executive director part. The non-executive director generally is not involved in the day-to-day operations. They wouldn't be at the IoDSA. They're not on our payroll. They would come in when there's a board meeting, typically 4 to 6 times a year, and interrogate what we're putting in front of them and question and guide and that sort of thing. That's, I think, the key difference.
Parmi, you mentioned 3 pillars of importance here. One is overseeing management. Then you spoke about strategy and also controls, by which you mean governance, I guess. As far as the overseeing of management is concerned, what does that mean, and typically how would that process play out?
Yeah, so, in a governance structure, you have shareholders generally who appointed a board of directors to oversee that the company is run properly, and management are the one running the company. Now, management can't check themselves, so to say, or mark their own homework, and that's why we have the board to oversee them. Generally, what this would mean is management would put forward plans, reports, all sorts of documents to the board to look at and interrogate and ensure that they're comfortable with what's happening. The board would also get information from other assurance providers like internal audit, external audit, etc., to ensure that the picture is making sense. What management is saying is agreeing with what internal audit is saying. It looks like things are well run. generally there'd be a delegation of authority document. And this document helps clarify what the role of the shareholder is versus what the role of the board is and what the role of management is. And it can be as specific as saying up to a certain value of expenditure management can approve, but anything above that would need to come to the audit committee or the board for approval. And that delegation is a very important mechanism to ensure, one, everybody understands exactly what they have the right to do and not do, and then also just to hold people accountable as well for sticking within their lane. And it works both ways, so we can't have management exceeding their powers and making decisions that they don't have the right to make. But at the same time, we can't have non-executive directors or board members interfering in management's ability to run the business on a day-to-day basis.
How much role would a board have, Parmi, in both influencing and developing company strategy?
So I think a very, very large role. I think that's a very important duty of board members. Management generally would put together the strategy, but it would get interrogated, discussed, amended, and finally approved at the board level. And the board would then monitor going forward whether that strategy is being implemented adequately.
So let's assume, Parmi, that Abe has got his director's chops here and he is appointed to a board. What would the common difficulties or challenges or even hindrances that a new board member might face, and how would they overcome them?
So I think there's a couple of things. And I mean, the question also up front was, do you sort of get the training beforehand or can you learn on the job? And I think there's a bit of both. So I think there's certain fundamental governance understanding that you need to have before you start, before you even apply. And whether that is through your experience, perhaps you're an executive already and therefore you understand how the board works because you're drafting papers to submit to the board. But regardless of which position you're in, you need to do some fundamental basic training on governance and understand how this all works. I think that's very important. Then once you've joined, I think, there's a couple of things we see. I think one of them is sometimes board members are working together for so long that you may see a level of what we call groupthink. And that is where they almost don't challenge each other. They sort of homogenous group. Decisions just get passed very easily with little interrogation and diverse perspectives. And generally when a new board member comes along, they would have that different or diverse perspective, which may become challenging. But if a board is well run with a very strong chairman, I think that should be overcome. The other thing for new board member, obviously, is you don't have the institutional knowledge that everyone else has. And when I say institutional knowledge, I mean specifics about that company, its history, its strategy, where it's come from and where it's going to. And that's also why induction is so important. And I think sometimes, we pay lip service to induction and it's just sort of done to tick a box. But it's very important that there's sufficient information and discussion in that induction session to enable a new member to hit the ground running as soon as they can.
Just a final one. You spoke about institutional knowledge being important. Is age preclusionary then in that respect? Do you have to be of a certain age? Or if you perhaps maybe like Abe is, and I'm assuming he's young and smart and ambitious and maybe under the age of 35, could he still be a director successfully?
Yes, he could. We need balance, right? So yes, we still need people who've had years of experience, who have the grey hairs and the scars to go with it all. But we also need younger people who are more innovative and tech savvy and all these things. We need a balance of both. So when we talk about diversity on boards, we're not just talking about race and gender. We're also talking about age, and we're also talking about, by the way, diversity of skill, of background, of industry, etc.